Welcome back to the Shuffle Squad. Zach Lesage here. Today we're going to be covering over the top 10 best meta decks in the Prismatic Evolutions formats. I cover these videos weekly, and this week we are going to see our lead up of decks heading into the regionals in Mexico this weekend. So far, we have not had any major events anywhere in the world outside of the Champions League Osaka that happened about a month ago, before Prismatic Evolutions was even released. I use a combination of online event results, my own testing, and any major events or in real life events when possible to determine these lists. Rankings do change on a week-by-week basis, and I do try to update these decks the best I possibly can. So if that sounds great to you, give this video a like, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Of course, you can always boost the YouTube algorithm and help out our channel by leaving a comment, maybe even putting what your top 10 best decks are. Or if you just want to say hi, I will say hi back. I do get back to all comments on this channel. All of the lists are going to be available for copy and paste right into PTCG Live in our pinned comments. So you can check the comment section. It's going to be right there up at the top. And if it's not there, let me know in the comments. I will put it up there. Sometimes I do forget. If you need any of the cards for the decks in this video, check out our sponsors at Kayfabe Cards for physical cards. They're where I get all of my cards. And of course, you can go to ptcgostore.com and use code TSS5 to save 5% off your order of code cards. You can craft whatever cards you want online. And of course, that allows you to build these decks in the game. Let's jump into our number 10 pick and see exactly what we're cooking with this week. Kicking off our top 10 is going to be Archaludon EX. We also have Origin Form Dialga and Banette as techs in this deck. This deck's falling down a little bit in the metagame because of just how the top decks are performing. Decks like Gardevoir EX can be a tough matchup even if you have those jamming towers, just because single prize card Pokemon can knock out the Dawn. Few other things like with Miraidon playing Zapdos, so they could use Ampy very much against Archaludon, and that's where this deck's going to be hanging on by a thread at number 10. The strategy is still going to remain the same of using Assemble Alloy onto your metal Pokemon accelerating energies, and that's probably either going to be the Dawn or the Dialga. I do like Banette in this deck to function as a second Pheasantipede in a lot of ways, being able to be a single prize card Pokemon as well, just having less liabilities on board. I don't really see too much changing with this deck. It doesn't look like it's popular in online events right now, falling out of the top 15 or so played decks at only about a 2% play meta share. So I think it's probably safe to say that it's going to be a lower half of the top 10 deck, or just falling out of the top 10 for the near future. At number 9 this week, we have Charizard EX returning into our top 10. At our recent late night 240 event, the only event in the Prismatic Evolutions online circuit that's hit over 300 players, we saw Charizard EX do decently okay by having a few in the top 32. I've seen some League Cup results for this deck, and I think the Precious Charlie build might be better than the Grand Tree build when it comes down to it. Being able to get your board set up using Technical Machine Evolution, that's a pretty solid way to get around Bidoof, that little green Pokemon that seems to be wreaking havoc on a lot of different decks. Looking through this deck, it seems most of it's going to be very similar to a previous Charizard EX deck that we've seen in last formats, except there might be some inclusions like the Technical Machine Evolution and of course Energy Surge that allows you to grab a fire energy out of your deck, and you can use that for the Technical Machine Evolution, allowing Arven to be live to grab those two cards. I think Charizard EX is going to be powerful enough to see success in our formats, but right now there are a few things holding it back. Maybe we'll see some decent finishes at Mexico. Maybe this is the right track for the list, and I wouldn't be surprised if this deck turned around and made it into the middle half of the list, but it might not necessarily be at its full glory. Only time will tell, but I do really like this list, and I'm going to build it in real life to prepare for some of my upcoming events that I have in Montreal, and of course, the European International Championships in London. At number 8 this week, we're going to see Pidgeot EX Control. Now, before I go on and dive in about this deck, I do want to say that Pidgeot EX Control is a deck that I think is almost always within the top 10, and I always struggle to include it in these lists. Quite often, it's not played by enough players to really see its true potential. But when it is played by a few players, most of them usually always find their way in the top cut of an event. There's almost always one Pidgeot control in the top cut of a regional championships. In this case, since we've only had online events, All Out Blitzel is probably our world's best Pidgeot EX control player. They're a Pidgeot EX control main, and they stream a lot of it on YouTube. Check out their YouTube channel. I took their exact list from the late night event where they made, I believe it was top 8, and that's what we have going on here. They largely control what the archetype looks like. So whether it's 1 player or 3 players or 5 players that are playing this deck, they are doing quite well at events, and I am including it here. Difficult deck to play, and you can see there's a lot of unique cards that you might not see in other decks, like the Chen Pao, not the EX, the Black Kyurem EX, and other cards too, like Picnic Basket. This build of Pidgeot EX control uses interesting cards to kind of stop your opponent in interesting ways. We utilize Grand Tree here nicely to get out Pidgeot EX very quickly, and not necessarily worrying about rare candy as much. And we can even use cards like Chen Pao to get rid of that Grand Tree so our opponent does not take advantage of it. Then we could use our other cards depending on the matchup, whether it's Milotic, Wellspring, or anything else that to slow our opponent down, have a wall, or even knock them out with cards like Blood Moon or Ursaluna EX. I think it's a deck like this that's interesting. I'm not an expert in, but I do know a top 10 deck when I see one. So I am going to include Pidgeot EX until I feel like decks, until it's not a top 10 deck. If you don't like it, that it is what it is, but I think I gotta be truthful when it comes to the metagame, and I do think that this deck's within the top 10. I did put it at number 8 this week. Maybe it will move up as weeks progress, but I'll continue to monitor and see exactly where the metagame is. Figured I'd give a decent explanation. I can't necessarily recommend or not recommend this deck because, again, I am not an expert. I feel like the Pidgeot control players, while there's only a few, they're definitely the experts when it comes to the format. At number 7, we have Snorlax, blocking the way, and I think that this build might be a little bit more better positioned than Pidgeot overall. At least it's played a little bit more, and I think it sees a decent bit more success at online Pokemon tournaments for now. Even though it has a little bit of a tough Lugia matchup, there are quite a few cards this deck plays, such as 4 handheld fans and Giacomo, that allow you to manipulate your opponent's energies so you're not necessarily worried about what they have going on there. I think that might be enough to beat some Lugia players, and it seems like a decent enough deck choice against a lot of other decks and formats. Being able to bring up whichever Pokemon you want to have in the active spot and your opponent does not want to have in the active spot that doesn't attack, and even if it can attack, using handheld fan to move those energies to Pokemon that you don't necessarily care about. Some decks just beat Snorlax, but a lot of decks just fold to this deck. So when it comes down to it, I think that it has a place in the metagame, and I think it's within the top 10 right now. And it's a very interestingly placed deck. The version with boxed order seems a little bit better, so we're not having so many liabilities in play. And if you can't play supporters, that's fine. Or if you can't play items, that's fine. We have access to Penny to be able to kind of get around our Snorlaxes, and we can use boss's orders to bring up Pokemon that we want. Your opponent's probably not going to have one Bidoof in the active against Snorlax. That would probably win, but might not necessarily win in time. We'll have to see. But right now, Snorlax at number 7, I think it's a pretty hot choice. At number 6, I almost feel like I'm introducing a new archetype to the metagame. This was previously Cloth Trapagos, but in our Prismatic Evolutions format, Cloth Trapagos has evolved into Poison Trapagos, and utilizing cards like Bidoof to use Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, Brute Bonnet, and of course, Bidoof's Itchy Pollen, and Binding Mochi as well, to do extra damage with Itchy Pollen. Your opponent's Pokemon are poisoned, and you have a lot of ways to manipulate damage counters with Iron Valiant EX. Trapagos EX having this huge attack with that 8 bench area 0 kind of play style, and we've switched over to 1 cloth as we've not necessarily become such a single prize card deck, and we've also cut cards like Hisuian Electrode V, considering Charizard EX is not really so much more meta. We can do some extra damage with cards like Black Belt's Training, another new card from Prismatic Evolutions. So I feel like this is kind of a new build for Poison Trapagos, the highest placing Trapagos EX deck in our format right now. and it's quite interesting when it comes down to it. We've seen some other tech cards like Ditto, the one that copies attacks out of your discard pile, being played in this deck. We've seen a variety of different things, but for now I think that this is a pretty solid list based off of what Alberto Conti posted on their X accounts. We're just trying to build up a big bench. We have a lot of different techs that we might use for different matchups, and maybe we want to turn one knock out our opponent's routes with Pekarent, or maybe we want to use Bidoof to slow our opponent down. Either way, I think this is one of the cooler decks in format, and it's one of the lesser explored decks. Shooting all the way to number 6 this week, maybe it's going to be even higher next week. We'll have to find out. At number 5, we have Dragapult EX with Charizard EX put together in one deck to try to counter the metagame in a variety of ways. Dragapult EX is very strong on its own because it can spread damage with that Phantom Dive, but that 200 base is not enough if you don't have cards like Dusknoir, or if you haven't previously placed damage counters with Phantom Dive. Charizard EX works as a way to accelerate energies to this Dragapult EX, but also gives you a backup attacker, so you can go Burning Darkness to knock out some very aggressive Pokemon. This is a build based off of what Oscar Madsen's posted on their X account. I think it's been seeing a decent bit of success at online events, enough for it to be number 5, one of the middle decks of the format. And maybe one of these Pokemon is within range of getting knocked out. Something like Hero's Cape does solve those, or you could just go Bidoof, big HP with Itchy Pollen. That's got to be a good strategy, right? I think that decks like these are quite interesting and underexplored in our format. I wouldn't be surprised if decks like this did quite well at our upcoming regionals, special event, and of course the European International Championships. I haven't personally tested this deck since the summer, but seeing it come back with Bidoof in full swing does make me have a lot of hope for this deck in the future. We'll have to see how it turns out. And I guess the next thing that I should say is the decks after this, I think the top 4 decks are really a cut above the rest of the decks in this top list. I think all of them are fighting for that S tier spot in the format, and some of them might fall to 1. But right now, I think until we see the results of Mexico, and that really starts to dictate how our metagame's going, the top 4 are really top 4. So lock in, double check the pinned comment for all those lists that you can copy and paste. And don't forget about our sponsors, where you can order those cards or get those code cards to build those decks whenever you want. Let's jump into our number 4 pick. At number 4, we have Lugia VSTAR, which might put this deck a little bit lower than other people might want it to be. I think Lugia VSTAR is the case of being one of the best decks of all time, but also seeing a lot of counters in the current metagame, really holding it back. We've seen Miraidon spike up. It has a shaky matchup with Gardevoir, and Dragapult Dusknoir is a lot closer than we want, whether or not we played the Regigigas with Jewel Breaker. Lugia VSTAR is still going to remain accelerating energies with that Archeops that you get back from Summoning Star and summoning up that Archeops. I went with more of a Cinccino heavy build so that we're able to use Special Roll to have a kind of blank slate of attackers against the metagame. We've seen some lists that play Wellspring Ogerpon. We've even seen some lists that play Drapion, that they're able to knock out a Gardevoir or whatever. We can't necessarily go with these specialized attackers without knowing the metagame. And if you get it right, that's great. But if you get it wrong, you'll have some dead weight on in your deck list. That's why I like going with the 2/2 rat version of this deck right now. And everything else with the deck is pretty standard across the board. So when it comes down to just a pretty generic Lugia deck, tossing a Gigas, this deck is pretty much exactly where it's at. But is that successful and good enough for our current format? 100%. This is one of the absolute best decks in our format. So I think Lugia VSTAR, totally worthwhile to try it until at least it rotates out in April. At number 3 this week, we have Miraidon EX. With that tandem unit ability, being able to search out all of those lightning type basic Pokemon. I think this build is looking pretty standard. We do have a Rotom V in our deck, which is becoming a little bit new. It's still pretty standard. It's just so if you are forced to go first, which this deck almost always wants to go second, you have access to instant charge to be able to draw +3. It's searchable by Miraidon. Why not have an opportunity to have that? And of course it's a Forest Seal Stone target, which works out really nicely. I did cut Night Stretcher or the Super Rod spot for this list for a Bravery Charm, just so I could protect my Magnemite a little bit more against Dragapult Dusknoir in the late game, so you're able to use Magneton against your opponent to get that game-winning knockout with Raichu, or whichever Pokemon, depending on what your opponent's board state is. I think that Miraidon EX having a strong matchup in both Gardevoir and Lugia, and being able to hold its own against Dragapult Dusknoir really solidifies it as number 3. I almost wanted to put it at number 2, but the top 2 are really, again, a cut above the other ones. I think Lugia and Miraidon are going to flip-flop between 3 and 4 for the rest of the format. Really, the top 2 decks are going to be quite pretty much the top 2 decks for a while, or at least we see the results of Mexico, Puerto Rico, and the European International Championships. I think that this list is something that I really like. It's probably my favorite current tier 1 deck in format. Give it a try. It's absolutely fantastic when you're able to rip through your opponent and even amp you very much to draw multiple prize cards. Let's jump into number 2. At number 2 this week, we have Dragapult EX with Dusknoir. Now, I think that this build to me is probably the perfect list when it's coming down to it. I put a lot of time and effort into crafting this list, and just being able to have extra cards like Lance to search out those Dreepy, Dracloak, and Dragapult under a Bidoof lock, and even Bidoof locking your opponent yourself really gives this deck a lot of life. I like having access to both Rotom and Bidoof in this deck, so when you're forced to go first and you can't use Bidoof, kind of like the Miraidon issue, we have access to draw +3, we have access to Forest Seal Stone, we have access to Temple of Sinnoh to knock out our opponent's special energies when we're playing against a Lugia. This deck is tastefully teched out, well thought out when it comes to the metagame, and I think it's just fantastic. When you play this deck perfectly, you're able to draw multiple prize cards between using Curse Blast, Phantom Dive, and using Radiant Alakazam to just set up these perfect turns. To me, I wouldn't want to play this deck any other way. I think that there's maybe a couple changes that you could make, like you could maybe cut an Artisan and maybe you could add a Thornton or something like this. But other than that, I think that Dragapult EX it's becoming more and more of a solved deck. Maybe in best of 3, you can get rid of one of your Bidoof. But other than that, I think that Dragapult EX is just a fantastic choice across the board. And I really hope that a lot of people get a chance to try it out. But it's not our number 1 deck. Our number 1 deck of the week is Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir EX is at our number 1 spot. Now, when I talk to every single player that's attending Mexico, and when I say every single player, a lot of my groups are higher end players. A lot of them are just playing Gardevoir. It just has so many great opportunities in this format, especially adding Bidoof into the deck, because now late game, you can go counter catcher up one of your opponent's Pokemon that they might not necessarily want in the active. Let's just say Radiant Greninja. And you could be like, cool, I'm going to play Iono against you. So now your opponent has a low card hand size. Then you're going to send up Bidoof. And then before you use Itchy Pollen, you're like, it's going to start moving some damage counters around with Monkey Dory to set up multi-prize card turns. Gardevoir EX has everything going for it. So it has access to manipulating your opponent's hands, manipulating damage counters, energy acceleration, built-in draw. Its army of attackers is really weird when you're looking at Pokemon like Screamtail, Fluttermane, Drifloon, Spiritomb, Cresselia, Mawile, but they all seem to work together to either slow down your opponent, retreat lock them, move damage counters off your Pokemon, lock their abilities, etc, 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 etc. I think across the board, Gardevoir EX just has the most tools. It gained a lot from the format just by adding Bidoof into it, and it's already a slower build, so we have those technical machine evolutions built in, so it doesn't necessarily slow itself down anymore. And of course, with some of the other decks leaving out of the metagame, this deck just becomes our clear number 1 choice. If you watched this video 2 weeks ago, you might be like, hey, Regidrago's there. Regidrago's not even part of our top 10 anymore. So keep up to date with the metagame with these top 10 weekly best decks videos on Fridays. Sometimes they might be Thursdays if there's an international championships or a major tournament that starts on a Friday. But other than that, we got our top 10 best decks right here. And I really hope you enjoyed watching. Let me close things out. Well, that's what we got going on with our top 10 this week. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video. And again, if you haven't given this video a like yet, what are you doing on this lovely Friday or whatever day it is when you're watching it? I put a lot of time and effort when it comes into creating these decks. I have a lot of phone calls with friends, a lot of research. So I do appreciate all the love whenever we can get it. And if you can tell anyone new about this channel, you'd forever be a real one. We're so close to 25K subs. I really want to get there because it's one of the big milestones in YouTube, right? Where you go from 100 subs, 1,000 subs, 5,000, 10,000, then it's really 25,000. Next up is going to be 50, so it's going to take us a minute to get there, but I hope with all the love and support that we've seen on the channel lately that it's a little bit sooner than that. If you're trying to learn anything more about the Pokemon TCG, be sure to hit me up for some coaching at metafy.gg/@ZachLasage. If you have any questions, you can always hit me up on Discord. I have all the links available in the description below. So I appreciate y'all for everything, and I'll catch up with y'all soon. If you're going to Mexico, best of luck. Maybe you'll even play one of the decks on this list. Other than that, we'll catch up with you for more great content next week. Peace out and have a great one. Want to support the Shuffle Squad? Be sure to check out all of our sponsors in the description to pick up Pokemon TCG singles, sealed, and PTCG live codes. You made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching this entire video from the Shuffle Squad. Honestly, from the bottom of our hearts, we appreciate each and every person that supports our content, watches what we have going on every single day, every single week, even from time to time, and continuously allows us to have a forum to project our creative content towards the Pokemon TCG community. So if you haven't already, be sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and even leave a comment to help boost the YouTube algorithm. That being said, we'll catch you with our next video. Thanks again. Take it easy.